So yeah, like I said, forests are considered a climax ecosystem. An old growth forest has taken hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years to evolve. From grasslands to shrubs to pioneer plants, and then eventually, some of the old growth forests start, and it takes all of these years. And what you see is an incredibly stable ecosystem that's able to sustain itself, that's able to withstand strong storms and droughts and all of these climatic extremes. And from an agroforestry perspective, what we really think is important is trying to introduce strategies of mimicking what nature does in an agroforestry type of situation. Obviously, that's not going to buffer us from all of the different, I guess you could say, political and climatic instabilities that are forthcoming. But I do think that finding ways to create stable food systems is one of the most important aspects of facing the instabilities we face, right? People and communities and nations that are able to feed themselves in a way that doesn't diminish the natural capacity of the soils, of the ecosystems we depend upon, is going to play an extremely important part, I think, in staying sane and staying safe and staying healthy throughout the instabilities that are coming. So that's kind of why I think I guess my political standpoint, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, about why transitioning towards sustainable, ecologically resilient food systems is going to be important, not only for the ecology of the places where we live, but also important in political terms of being able to feed ourselves, of being able to really cement a sense of food security as things begin to unravel. So the title of class today is Why Trees Matter on Farms, Embracing Agroforestry for Resilient Landscapes and Food Systems. Briefly, I'm going to outline what is agroforestry. Um, and not necessarily from just an academic definition, but really taking our cue from civilizations and peoples throughout history who have created extremely resilient agroforestry systems. So, like I've said, um, when we think of agriculture, most people generally think that the agricultural revolution, which started in the Neolithic period sometime between 5 and 10,000 years ago, was essentially cutting down forests, learning to plant perennial grains, right? So rice in different Asian contexts, wheat in the Middle East, and then into Europe, corn in this part of Central America and Mexico, other, for example, tubers in the Andes. And obviously, these annual grain crops did play an important part in the rise and fall of civilizations. Um, but there has always been kind of on the fringe, smaller communities that existed mostly autonomously, um, meaning separate from the state apparatus, from the civilizational efforts throughout history. And in many cases, what made these small communities so resilient was the fact that they didn't depend on these annual grain crops, right? They didn't depend on just growing corn, just growing wheat or rice or whatever it might be, but they really found ways to diversify their diet through agroforestry systems. So I want to take a look at historical look at some of these communities, some of these indigenous groups, some of these kind of fringe peasant societies that were really able to sustain a healthy, long-term resiliency through creating these brilliant agroforestry models. And then quickly look at why it's important to integrate trees into the landscape. Again, one of a lot of times people have this idea that farming is kind of goes together with cutting down trees and replacing it with pasture, replacing it with annual grain crops. In many parts of the world, the expansion of the agricultural frontier is responsible for an enormous amount of deforestation. So you can look, for example, in South America, enormous parts of the Brazilian and South American Amazon rainforest are being lost year by year by year as the rainforest is cut down, converted into savanna or pasture land for beef, and also for soybeans, which is essentially for growing beef. Soybeans are made into animal feed, which then feeds the animal Yeah, the animals that we raise, the domestic animals we raise. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only way to do farming. There's an enormous, again, history of how to integrate trees into a productive landscape. And then quickly, I want to look at some of the challenges from a community perspective, from the perspective of small scale farmers. If there are so many benefits that we're going to look at to integrating trees into productive farming landscapes, why aren't more people doing it? And then lastly, I want to look at 7 strategies for how you can do it, for how we can do this, how small farmers, medium scale farmers, large scale farmers can integrate trees into a productive setting. But yeah, real quick, take a look at historicity, the historical perspective of deforestation over the last 10,000 years, so more or less coinciding with what we consider to be the birth of farming or the Neolithic Revolution. The world has lost at least 1/3 of its forest, an area that's twice the size of the United States. If you look at this really interesting graph, so about 10,000 years ago, a little less than 2/3 of the world was covered in forest, about 6 billion hectares, and the remaining 42% was wild grassland and shrubs, right? So there was really, there was obviously a human population, but we were hunters and gatherers. We had very limited technologies in the sense that it limited how we could really change the landscape, right? 5,000 years ago, which is kind of when the Neolithic, when farming really took off, there was still 55% forests. You see a small little group of croplands starting to pop up, especially in the Middle East, in certain areas of Asia, where the first civilizations start to take root. Really, there was very little forest loss over, the next almost 7,000 years. So between 5,000 years ago and in the year 1700, we still maintained about 52% of forests. Up until about 100 years ago, 125 years ago, there was still almost half of the world's land was covered in forest, right? So there's kind of this popular pop sci narrative that everything really started to go south 10,000 years ago when human beings transitioned from hunter and gatherers into, farming, settled farming communities. Obviously, that was a monumental change in how humanity organized itself, how civilizations were born, all of the demographic changes with that. But honestly, the amount of change in the landscapes was minimal, right? Our ability to drastically change the world in which we lived was relatively limited. So from about 55% to 48%. We lost about 7% of forest cover over almost 7,000 years. In the last 100 years, we've gone from 48% to 38% forests. So like this graph says, almost, half of the deforestation, an enormous amount of deforestation that's occurred, has occurred just in the last 100 years, right? And so what we see is in our modern day, we have less forest, much less wild grasslands and shrubs as well, and an enormous amount of land that is managed by human intervention. So grazing land, like I said, cutting down forest, planting grasses, and putting domestic cattle and sheep and whatnot onto those lands, and 15% for crops, mostly by large scale farming, right? So again, most of the forest lost that has occurred in the last 100 years, which we can say is the strongest moment of fossil fuel powered agriculture, the industrial agricultural revolution, the introduction of machinery, the introduction of large scale GMO crops, et cetera, et cetera. What is agroforestry? One really simple definition is the process of thoughtfully integrating trees, bushes, and other perennial species into a productive agricultural system for the production, and here's the kind of the 3 F's: food, fiber, and fuel, and for other diverse ecological and systemic benefits to the overall agricultural system, right? So one of the things that a lot of times people forget about is that trees do provide food. A lot of times we think about fruit. Obviously apples and peaches and pears and plums grow on trees. But one of the things that we have forgotten is that there are over 70,000 edible plant species, and around 40,000 of those edible plant species come from trees, right? So just in the area of the world that I live in, there are hundreds of different fruit trees. There are dozens of different nuts. And there are also trees that provide what are known as staple crops, right? So a lot of people think, well, it's great, we can plant more fruit trees, we can have a few nuts here and there, but we still need our grain, we still need our corn and our wheat and our rice. But what we're going to talk about is that there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of different carbohydrate crops, so staple crops that grow on trees, right? Here on my farm, we're going to talk about in the last 5 years, we've introduced what's known as the chachafruto, which is a tree native to the Andes Mountains in South America, which produces at least 5 times more production per hectare of a bean crop. So the Colombians call it the tree potato because it's kind of like a potato that grows on a tree, but it's really a bean, so it's a high protein crop that grows on trees, right? And like I said, agroforestry isn't something new. It's not something that we've kind of developed in as a response to this deforestation. No, rather, small communities, agricultural communities throughout the years have developed extremely productive and diverse agroforestry systems. We're going to talk real quickly about some of these historical precedents in different parts of the world. The Mayan forest gardens in the part of the world where I live in Central America, breadfruit and taro food systems in the Pacific Islands, etc. Another definition, or maybe a anti-definition of agroforestry, is that from a permaculture perspective, from a land health perspective, agroforestry is not planting a monoculture of tree species for purely commercial ends. Here in all parts of the world, there's all of these green washing schemes where native forest is cut down. Here in Central America, several years ago, there was a huge boom in planting rubber plantations. So essentially, they cut down, diverse, healthy forest ecosystem and plant one crop of trees, which is the rubber tree, which is extremely intensive. The rubber trees are grown for a short amount of time and then they're cut down. We see pine plantations in the lumber industry in many parts of the global north, where again, resilient, healthy ecosystems are cut down, and what's replaced is a monoculture of trees. Avocado plantations in many parts of Asia, you see an enormous deforestation for palm oil. So certain types of palm trees. In the carbon credit, in trying to reduce carbon emissions, there was the whole thing about forest plantations for carbon credit schemes. So again, big polluting companies and countries would finance essentially the eradication of native forest ecosystems for large-scale monoculture plantations of certain crops, the tree crops that could be harvested in an industrial way. When I talk about agroforestry, this is obviously not, the ideal. It's not what we're looking to mimic. Again, one of I guess from a scientific perspective, the idea of integrating trees into a productive system. In a sense, how can we create food products from trees is almost over 100 years ago. In 1929, a famous agronomist by the name of J. Russell Smith published this book called Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture. He defines this tree crop-oriented permanent agriculture as integrating nuts, fruits, and fodder into farming systems for soil conservation, food, and sustainable land use, especially on slopes, on sloped land, a concept foundational to modern agroforestry and permaculture, promoting deep-rooted perennials over destructive plowing for long-term resilience. J. Russell Smith lived through what's known as the Dust Bowl era of the United States, when essentially farmers moved west into the Great Plains and plowed up the native prairie, and they found this enormously fertile soil that they started planting grain crops on. And after a couple years, there was a drought, and then there were windstorms, and essentially, thousands of years of fertile soil that had been built up in this area was, created these massive dust storms and was lost. And J. Russell Smith said, instead of doing this, why don't we, instead of plowing the land year after year after year to plant a corn crop, to plant a grain crop, a wheat crop, why don't we anchor the soil in these trees. And he started doing all this research and finding how Native American populations in the United States depended on acorns and on hazelnuts and on all of these different types of perennial tree species that anchored the soil that didn't have to be plowed year after year. And like I said, there are dozens of extremely unique and inspiring examples of agroforestry systems all around the world. I think people generally understood that if you could start a system wherein you didn't have to do the backbreaking labor of plowing the land, planting, weeding, harvesting year after year after year, it just made sense, right? Maybe there's something evolutionarily in us that's still a hunter and gatherer, right? And if we can obtain our sustenance from trees that we plant once and that we take care of, and then that we simply, harvest when the time comes, that's obviously preferential. From the perspective of labor, from the perspective of ease, from the perspective of the small farmer. It's much preferable to do that than to go through the backbreaking labor of having to till the soil, plant, etc. Right? In the Iberian Dehesa, which is in Spain and Portugal, there's this at least a 2,000-year-old system called the Dehesa. The Dehesa is essentially a pasture land where chestnut trees and acorns have been planted and maintained. These are trees that are in many cases, over 500 years old. It blends woodlands and pastures where chestnuts alongside oaks provide food during the acorn and the chestnut season, provides wood, provides shade for livestock like Iberian pigs, and creates a rich, sustainable landscape and a unique flavor profile for the cured meats. In many cases, lots of the chestnuts are harvested for people's own consumption, but there's so many chestnuts and so many acorns that fall on the ground during the harvest season, so in the fall time, that it's impossible to harvest them all. So what they do is they take their livestock, they take their pigs and their sheep and their goats, and they essentially pasture them underneath these trees. And especially in the case of Iberian ham or the pork, it ends up being one of the highest qualities meats because of the high protein of the nuts that the pigs eat. And so farmers are able to get an enormously expensive and high price for the cured meats of the pigs that are pastured on these in this Dehesa system. In Central America and southern Mexico, what's known as huertas, or is loosely translated as Mayan forest gardens, are a traditional growing technique that is at least 3 or 4 thousand years old. We often think of rainforests as untouched, but the Mayan forest that goes again all the way through southern Mexico, all throughout Central America, can be understood as the garden of the ancient Maya. The Mayan people have been creating sustainable forest gardens to provide for their needs for food, medicine, etc., while enriching the forest. And many times, these forest gardens, are simply trying to integrate as many perennial species as possible within the traditional milpa, or the corn and bean, the three sister form of traditional agriculture. So a lot of times, I don't know if you've heard of this, but a lot of kind of famous agronomists look at traditional Mayan growing techniques, and they talk about how they intersperse three crops, what's known as the three sisters. So you have the corn, you have the beans, and you have certain types of squash. And they say this is a much better than the monoculture of corn that you see in many North American contexts. But this Three Sisters is kind of misleading, because when you really go into a Mayan forest garden, yes, you'll see corn growing, you'll see beans underneath those corn crops, you'll see different types of pumpkins and gourds growing as a ground cover in between the beans and the corn. But then you also see avocado trees, which are native trees, as an overstory interspersed. You'll see at least 12 or 13 different types of kind of natural greens, wild spinach that grows amongst the corn and beans. You'll see lots of different medicinal plants that are also grown in this type of forest garden. In one study, when I lived in Guatemala, we did a study to see how many different types of plants small Mayan farmers continued to integrate into these systems. In one case, we found up to 45 both edible and medicinal plants that were growing amongst the corn, bean, and squash of the Three Sisters. So these forest gardens are again a way of trying to integrate as many crops as possible within traditional growing systems. In the South Pacific Islands, breadfruit and taro, planting those two together in plantations is a traditional and effective agroforestry strategy. Because taro fills the space. Taro is like a type of tuber, like a sweet potato, that grows in many times in wetlands and very wet soil. Um, Taro fills the space and provides early income while breadfruit trees grow, creating a resilient food system with complementary crops that offer diverse nutrients, cover different needs, and support agricultural continuity. This is the breadfruit tree here. It's essentially like I said, a staple carbohydrate crop. It's kind of like a big potato that grows on a tree. Whereas, if you're growing potatoes or sweet potatoes or yucca or whatever it might be, you have to plant that every year. You have to till the soil. Once you get a breadfruit plantation started, it will fruit for anywhere between 50 to 125 years. So it's kind of you do the work once, you care for the trees, and in many cases, these trees can start to produce in 4 or 5 years, right? And then underneath that, you have these large leafed plants, which are the taro root, which many agricultural historians say is the first kind of agricultural crop that humanity learned to domesticate. And it's because it's one of the easiest things to grow. You plant one tuber, and around each tuber, you have, 5, 10, 15, 20 sucker plants that grow up that you can then separate and plant next to it. So there's over 30,000 years people have been growing these crops. Lewis Mumford, who's a cultural historian, he saw the breadfruit tree, especially in Polynesia, as a model of natural abundance and human adaptation, a truly utopian plant providing for basic needs with minimal effort, contrasting with industrial food systems. He saw that wherever there was an abundance of breadfruit trees that had been planted and cared for by people, people were essentially able to exist outside of the state. They didn't need, a strong man government to, that would come in and would take away, through taxation. Said, that these communities that existed essentially autonomously for thousands of years depended on these agroforestry systems that they had created. There's even evidence that the largest supposedly natural forest ecosystem in the world, the Amazon rainforest, may very well have been selected for over thousands of years by the millions of Amazonian indigenous people. The Amazon has been inhabited for thousands of years, right? We know that there's still obviously lots of uncontacted tribes living in the depths of the forest. But what archaeologists have been discovering is that these indigenous groups have actively shaped the Amazon for millennia, not just living with it, but cultivating it through selective plant breeding, right? By selecting for cassava, for planting cocoa trees, creating fertile dark soils through using biochar, building complex infrastructure like canals through the forest, and managing landscapes with agroforestry. One of the best examples of that is that this tree here is what's known as the Brazil nut tree, which is a naturally occurring tree in the Amazon rainforests. But botanists have determined that if these trees were only self-seeded or by squirrels, taking the nuts and burying them, you could expect to see per hectare maybe one or two Brazil nut trees, because there's other species that are competing for space, competing for light, for nutrients. But when you go into certain parts of the Amazon, the Brazil nut tree is what dominates, right? Instead of seeing one or two Brazil nut trees per hectare, you see 15 or 20. It's kind of the dominant species in the highest layer of the forest canopy. And what they say is that because this is one of the main sources of protein and carbohydrate for many of the indigenous tribes living within the Amazon. Over thousands of years, people selected for this, right? They said, we want these trees because, they provide habitat, they provide food for us. So this process of understanding how the forest grows and slowly selecting for those types of trees that benefit communities is an example of agroforestry practices. So in many cases, large areas of the Amazon rainforest are also an example of agroforestry practice by indigenous groups. Why should we integrate trees then into the landscapes? Obviously, there's historical precedent for it. Like I said, the communities that have done this have been some of the most stable, long-lasting civilizations, communities that we know on Earth, right? Most of civilizations that have depended on grain crops, right? So the large, the early states, Mesopotamia, even Rome, in certain here in Central America, the Mayan kingdoms, the Aztecs, communities that depended on grain crops generally follow a civilizational cycle of rising and falling, of rising and collapsing, right? And that just occurs because grain crops tend to deplete soil, tend to be much more susceptible to drought and to other climatic abnormalities, whereas communities that have developed these resilient agroforestry systems, right, instead of depleting the soil, they're enriching it. In years where there's heavy droughts, trees have much deeper root systems. They're much more resilient. They can last longer. They can take all of these issues, right? We know that integrating trees into any landscape, almost any landscape, obviously there's certain areas of the world, natural grasslands where, integrating trees might come at a disadvantage. But in many places where forest ecosystems are the norm, trees will improve soil health. They help to conserve water. They can provide an enormous diversity of products, right? Not just apples and oranges, right? Not just fruit, but all different types of food, perennial grain crops that grow on trees, right? Perennial carbohydrate and staple crops, all of the different high protein nuts. It also provides fibers, right? For all of the different, for making rope, for creating clothing for humans. It provides fuel, obviously, for heating and for cooking. Trees, because of their enormous root systems, help to reduce erosion. They also create a permanent kind of mulch layer on top of the soil that helps protect the soil. They also sequester carbon, right? Every time that we turn over the soil, that we till the soil, there's an enormous amount of carbon dioxide that leaches out of the soil and into the atmosphere. With a forest ecosystem, the opposite occurs. As trees grow, the growth of their trunk and their branches and their leaves is essentially carbon dioxide that was sucked up by the tree and sequestered into the wood, into the branches, into the root systems, etc. Right? So it's a way of increasing. If we were to find a way to go back from the 38% forest cover that we have today back to the 55% that existed 7,000 years ago, how much excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could be sequestered in those living forest ecosystems? Obviously, trees offer habitat and biodiversity for wildlife, for insects, protects livestock and crops from extreme weather. It's an income diversification strategy for small farmers. The more diverse tree crops that you have, the more ability that we're going to be able to have to grow crops. Here, sorry, I accidentally made this small. Let me make it big again here. Yeah, the more diverse tree crops you have, the more protected you are. If one crop fails, you can have another one be successful. There we go. Uh, and also, agroforestry systems do offer much reduced costs for the small scale farmer over the long term. Establishing an agroforestry system generally requires an upfront investment, purchasing the trees, getting them in the ground, watering them, setting up the systems. But once they're established and once they start production, you don't have the yearly costs associated with purchasing seed, purchasing fertilizer, hiring out labor to till the land, all of these different things, right? And then also it enhances the food security and the food sovereignty of the livelihoods of small farmers, right? So if there are all of these different benefits that come with integrating trees into the landscape, why isn't everybody doing it? There are some challenges. Like we mentioned, there are some high upfront costs. Also, market demand prioritizes annuals, monocultures, and grains that are used by the industrial food system, right? The whole kind of Ricardian economic analysis of comparative advantage. Small farmers have kind of learned that, for example, in the part of the world where I live in, so many small farmers down on the coast grow sugarcane because that's what what the United States wants. That's what they want from us to produce because we have a nice, hot, humid climate down on the coast. We can produce sugarcane and we can export it to the United States. Or up in the mountains, we can grow coffee. And we can grow coffee so that we can export it to the United States. In many parts of North America and in other parts of the world, there's all of these complex subsidies, government subsidies that prioritize and farmers growing corn and wheat and soybeans. So there's market demand for the most destructive forms of agriculture, right? The world, like I mentioned, has over 50,000 edible plants. Some estimates say up to 70,000. But just three of them, rice, corn, and wheat, provide 60% of the world's food energy intake. Imagine if we could just convert 30% of that, move away from this, not completely, but half of the corn, the wheat, the soybeans, the rice that we grow. If we could transfer that land into diverse agroforestry systems, growing breadfruit and all of the different chestnuts and acorns and all of the different varieties of perennial food crops that grow on trees. There's also a lack of consumer demand. A lot of these food crops have been forgotten. Though, in many cases, maybe our grandparents' generation subsisted or really enjoyed all of the diverse food crops that could grow on trees. In the last, 3, 4 generations, a lot of people have forgotten about that. We've gotten accustomed to essentially subsisting on just a few crops, right? On corn and soybeans and all of the different annual grains and how they're transformed by this enormously complex agro industry that has kind of come to dominate the food systems in which we live. Like I said, the initial startup costs a lot of, there's not a lot of subsidies that help small farmers make the agroforestry transition. There is an instability period. How do you weather the storm over the first 5 or 6 years until your tree crops start to produce? So all of these are kind of challenges that small farmers around the world face towards introducing trees, making the agroforestry transition. So real quick to end with, so we can open up a period of questions and hearing from you all. I want to share 7 quick strategies about how small farmers around the world, small communities in both urban and rural areas can start to incorporate agroforestry practices in the landscapes where we live. One, incorporate nitrogen fixing trees. There are dozens of trees that have the ability essentially to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into their root systems. It's essentially what leguminous trees do. Nitrogen is kind of the main food source for trees around the world. And these trees, nitrogen fixing trees, generally are easy to get started. They grow very quickly. They're easy to propagate. They generally provide good forage for animals. So even if you just planted a local nitrogen fixing tree, along your fence line, it's a great way to feed your sheep or your goats or your cattle or whatever it might be, especially during the dry season when there are not as much grasses. Nitrogen fixing trees also create great mulch for increasing yields of annual crops. They're generally cheaper to source, propagate, and incorporate. And many also offer edible food options, right? So here I have a friend that has a small farm in Vermont in the United States, and this is called seaberry, which is a small nitrogen fixing bush. It's a perennial bush crop. And it produces an enormous amount of these little, very, very kind of tart, like fruits, like berries. The sea berry has about 5 times as much vitamin C as oranges. And so he started a small business where this was a crop where he purchased maybe 3 or 4 of these bushes, got them started over the first couple years, and then propagated them on himself. You take cuttings, put them in the ground, and they root out. And now one of the main income sources for his small farm is turning all of this enormous amount of sea berries into juices that he sells at a local farmer's market. So it was a way to really incorporate agroforestry practices without much initial investment. Another strategy is to mimic local agricultural systems. One central tenet of permaculture design is always to observe your local ecosystem and take your cues from what is observed there. This doesn't necessarily mean that only native tree species can be included in the transition to agroforestry. However, proper observation will allow one to consider which species are best adapted for the local conditions. This is the chachafruto tree that I mentioned, the tree potato. This isn't native to Central America, it's native to South America. But I visited a friend in Colombia about 6 years ago, and we went and visited a farm, and I saw these trees, and they're related to a tree that grows like crazy in the mountains of El Salvador where I live. We were able to bring back some seed, get them started, and now we have a small nursery where we propagate these trees and give them to local farmers. And they're incredibly abundant. They're easy to care for, and they provide a great food alternative for people in our community. Also, search for easy transitions. When a tree crop is introduced into an agricultural system, it should take relatively easy. It shouldn't be hard to do. I won't read this whole quote here, but this is a picture here of a local native tree here in the area where I live called the Tatascamite tree. And it's for the longest time I was trying to find a tree crop that flowered that was able to really kind of bring in bees and other pollinating species. And I tried to bring in seeds of trees that didn't grow here, non-native species. And then eventually I talked to the local bee grower or the local bee farmer, and he said you should plant some tatascamite trees. And I knew what they were, but I didn't know that they flowered like this. So a lot of times, and they grow extremely easy. You don't even have to propagate them. You just throw some seed out onto the field, and after a couple of years, you'll have these trees, growing incredibly quickly. So searching for, in many cases, native trees are those which are going to grow best in your system. Strategy four, contouring your landscape. If you're designing a system from zero, which means essentially you're incorporating trees into a degraded pasture land or into a grassland, a place where there are really no trees in the farm ecosystem. You should start with contouring the landscape. Essentially, that means finding the level, right? And then you can plant those diverse tree species on the downside of those contour lines. Within the contour lines, you can incorporate swales or irrigation ditches, berms. This really helps to prevent erosion and water management. You can increase the space.
Tobias,
Yeah.
what do you mean by planting the trees on the downside?
So contour is essentially like finding the level of your land. There's lots of different, simple tools that you can use, like a water level. There's another thing called an A-frame, but it's essentially finding, where are the level lines along your landscape. And so here, this is a farm that I helped to contour in Montana many years ago. And so what you do is you take these tools, you find the line, you stake it out. And then you essentially create these irrigation ditches or these swales. So what happens is when it rains very heavily, the water doesn't run over the top of the landscape, but it falls into these ditches essentially, and it stays there because they're on contour. The water doesn't run to the left, to the right, doesn't run over the landscape, but rather sinks into the landscape. It's a way of keeping the water onto your land. And so what this farmer did after we contoured and dug all of these ditches. What he did is he bought different types of trees and bushes and planted them here on the bottom side of these contour ditches. So that was a way of easy irrigation. Every time it rained, the water accumulated in these ditches. Once the trees grew, they provided kind of a really strong foundation for the ditches so that the water wouldn't run over. And it's a way of creating a very aesthetically pleasing landscape as well that has the benefit of reducing erosion, of filtrating water into the aquifers, into the landscape, etc. Right? We'll see a picture this
So,
year.
so would you suggest putting like berries or little short shrub nuts?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends what you want to do in the landscape. This one here, this was going to be pasture land for goats and sheep. So
uh,
what he planted was fodder trees. So different types of, fodder trees are trees that, have high protein in their leaves that herbivores, so sheep and goats and cattle really like. So what he did is he planted these on contour, and then whenever the grass is, there was not a lot of grass, you could go through and chop down
wow.
some of the branches and give that to the goats and the sheep. But yeah, certainly you can plant fruits, you
Yeah,
can
this is
plant
amazing because
berries.
I've never seen this strategy before.
Oh yeah, it's really unique, and like I said, there are some really beautiful large scale projects of contouring the landscape that's happening in lots of places. Even large scale industrial farms are starting to contour their lands just because it doesn't take a lot of money to do, and it makes a lot of sense in terms of water management. And then, yeah, incorporating trees on contour. This is a farm in Wisconsin, in the United States, where all of these trees that you see here are different nuts. So chestnuts and hazelnuts. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But also silvopasture. So silvopasture is essentially the mixing of pasture land and trees, right? Putting trees on grassland and then putting animals in between those trees. So if you want to do raise animals, and I know many of our students are from Africa, and I know there's lots of raising of goats and sheep and cattle. Instead of just doing that on pasture land, designing pastures for grazing animals. That introduce tree crops for fodder, for food and fuel, offers an enormous benefit for the overall system. Obviously, once those trees are established, the animals aren't gonna cause them harm. It creates shade. It protects the grasses, especially during the hot and dry season. In terms of dollars and cents, silver pasture systems that incorporate on contour fodder tree crops can drastically reduce the purchase of hay and animal feed. So it makes sense economically for small farmers as well. This is what I mentioned, restoration agriculture, which is a term that was defined by Mark Shepard, who's a farmer in Wisconsin. And he's trying to mimic natural diverse ecosystems like forests or prairies that produce food, fiber, and fuel while actively healing degraded land, rebuilding soil health, and increasing biodiversity while improving water cycles and moving beyond mere sustainability to actively regenerate the environment. What's unique about this kind of restoration agriculture is that Mark Shepard, the farmer who's kind of behind it, he outlines how tree staple crops could be integrated into the existing industrial farm paradigm. So he has like a 500-acre farm in Wisconsin where instead of growing corn and soybeans for the industrial kind of food system, he all of this is mechanized. It uses large scale tractors, but instead of growing corn and soybeans, he's adapted the machinery to be able to harvest chestnuts and hazelnuts and acorns. And essentially, together with some other people, he's finding that the yield. The amount of carbohydrates and protein that come from chestnuts and hazelnuts mimics, what the land can produce in terms of corn and soybeans. So if what the industrial food systems want is essentially carbohydrate and protein that can then be manufactured into food outputs, he said, why don't we do this in a way that instead of having to till the land year after year after year and create all of this erosion and depend on agrochemicals. Why don't we do the same with tree crops? In his case, chestnuts and hazelnuts, right? So it's a way of kind of trying to integrate agroforestry into the existing industrial kind of food system. And lastly, syntropic agroforestry. This is something, especially in tropical areas around the world. It Like other systems, it's trying to mimic natural forests succession to build soil, boost biodiversity. One of the things that's unique about this is that if you have like a degraded landscape, let's say a piece of the Amazon rainforest that's been cut down and turned into pasture, if human beings were to eventually, leave that piece of land alone, over 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 years, whatever, that degraded landscape would eventually return to the climax ecosystem of the rainforest, right? But it takes time. And syntropic agroforestry is saying we can as farmers who observe how natural forest ecosystems evolve, we can be involved in accelerating this succession, trying to help the forest return to its climax state, but in a much, faster time frame. And instead of tree species that really aren't of any use to us human beings, we can kind of like the Amazon, like people in the Amazon did by selecting for the Brazil nut. We can also design agroforestry systems that mimic, the natural forest, but with tree species that provide food, fiber, and fuel for us, right? So it's kind of about accelerating the natural succession of degraded landscapes. So I'd say the hope for agroforestry systems is to go from this, which is obviously in the world in which we live, incredibly unstable. Obviously there's unstable climatic issues to take into account, a heating world, unstable supply lines for farmers that depend on industrial produced fertilizers and other synthetic inputs, to a system that is able to maintain its fertility, that's able to provide its own seed, that's able to self-propagate, and also provide, obviously all of the ecological benefits, while at the same time providing an enormous amount of food, fiber, and fuel for the human communities that live in these places. So that's kind of the hope. And I wanted to share that as we start 2026 in this era of extreme uncertainty, I really think that trying to mimic the stability of a forest in the way that we produce something as essential as food, which all of us need 3 times a day, is kind of a way to maybe to maintain our sanity in this world in which we live as we try to work towards a new sort of stability. So I'll go ahead and end there and look forward to whatever you all have to say.
Yeah, this is amazing. You know what I'm thinking is that if you could prepare like a document that you could upload into chat with just links to videos on
Mm.
to further explore these topics,
Yeah.
or web pages, or videos on YouTube or
Certainly.
podcasts or whatever. Yeah, just and then links, and then the students could just take that document and look at the links and start exploring more. I'm seeing lots of ways to actually make money off of this.
Oh yeah.
So can you imagine providing a service to farmers where you select the trees that they need and you go ahead and plant them and take care of them on their farms to increase their production, and they can actually get the food from those trees?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that's actually something that we're doing on our farm. We've been here for 10 years now and have experimented and tried to figure out what works. And with my wife, we're at the point now, I think that we know what type of kind of innovative tree crops grow well in our area. So we like it about a year and a half ago, we started a small nursery where we propagate a lot of the different trees that we've established that we know that grow well, that are extremely productive, that are easy to care for. And yeah, we sell those at a very discount price to local farmers. So if people, a lot of times come and visit our farm and they see the abundance, they understand that, if you have a tree that's producing, it's pretty easy to get started. And so, yeah, I think that there's a huge demand. There should be a huge demand for, especially for nurseries that provide the stock, right, for people that want to get started. I think that's a very important service, and also, like you said, a money-making opportunity for people for sure.
So there's a question here from Pedro from Cabo Verde. What environmental indicators can be used to measure the positive impact of introducing trees into farming systems?
Yeah, yeah, that's I've always really wanted to uh try and find I don't know who it is, some sort of environmental engineer that has the ability to measure the amount of carbon that you can sequester through agroforestry systems. That's something I don't know. Maybe that might be kind of I don't know if there's still going to be a lot of money available for sequestering carbon. I don't know if the world cares about that anymore. But there is still, all of the carbon credit schemes about how to, how small farmers can go from, causing an enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions to sequestering that carbon. And there's all these different ways that you can store or improve the amount of carbon in your soil, obviously in the trees that you grow, in bamboo plantations. So yeah, like Pedro, I think that there's a huge opportunity to really look at how much carbon is being sequestered through this transition to agroforestry. And I think that if there is still going to be these finance mechanisms for carbon sequestration, for all of it, it used to be called the red forestry thing. There's a lot of different finance mechanisms. I think it would be fantastic if small farmers who committed to making this transition could also be rewarded for the ecological service that they're providing in helping to sequester the excess amount of carbon dioxide that industrial society has put into the atmosphere.
I might also add in, you could also check the soil to see if it's building up topsoil, if the amount of sand in the soil is going down in relation to organic material. Check for the number of worms. You can check for wildlife that are now moving into the area. You can check for the temperature of the surface area of the earth to see if that surface area temperature is going down because of
Yeah.
shading. There's lots and lots and lots of things.
Yeah, you can. I'm sure there's ways to measure aquifers, how much, obviously the more trees in the landscape, the more that water is going to infiltrate into the soil that builds up aquifers, which obviously benefit people who, live downstream, especially people who depend on these aquifers in cities and urban areas as well.
Look, I see a question here from Donna Jonas. Do you see that question?
From who, sorry?
Donna Jonas, Emmanuel, is with rapid
Yeah, I see it
population
here.
growth.
In Mali's Sahel region, the tree crisis reflects a delicate struggle to balance immediate human survival with long-term environmental sustainability. The country faces a dual challenge, an urgent need for fuel and the relentless advance of the Sahara Desert. The problem is driven by massive dependence, accelerating forest loss, and a critical link between climate degradation and security risks. Despite these challenges, a significant shift is underway toward community-led conservation, notably through national reforestation methods and farmer managed natural regeneration. Yeah, Donna, that's a great case, and I've heard, the famous Green Wall, I think is what it's called, across the Sahel region. And one of the, yeah, when you mentioned the FMNR, the Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, what I understand of that and what I think is so incredibly innovative is that it's not focused on planting trees, right? It's not about, we need, some big NGO to bring in these trees and to help the farmers plant these trees and take care of them. No, the farmer managed natural regeneration says that, look, all of these native tree species, even though they've been cut down, even though they've been overgrazed and things like that, they will sprout back up. They have these incredibly resilient root systems, and so a lot of this farmer managed natural reforestation is focused on essentially taking care of the stumps. These trees that are there, and that as long as you learn to take care of them, they'll regenerate and they'll be there by themselves. So again, it's a strategy focused on traditional knowledge of what exists, of essentially taking care of what's already there. And that's a really fascinating example. And I hope that, yeah, that the Green Wall continues to protect all of the African communities from the advance of the Saharan Desert for sure.
So where are we on time? We have a couple of minutes here. Che was just saying, how can this system be helpful to peasant farmers, especially in Africa, where there's still enough agricultural farmland? And I just wrote down, increase production, improve quality of food, but what else can you throw in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big myths that industrial agriculture has thrown at us is that the most productive landscape is a monoculture, right? And so there's a lot of kind of yeah, industrial, proponents of large scale agriculture will say that, if people sign on to monoculture, just growing corn, well, then we can throw a lot of, NPK fertilizer on it. We can, throw a bunch of Roundup Ready glyphosate and get rid of all the weeds. And, at least in the short term, the corn, the amount of corn that's harvested is going to be much more than what traditional, farmers did with, their traditional farming practices. That might be true on a crop to crop basis. It's probably not true over the long run as soil continues to be depleted, as agrochemicals build up in the system. But it's also completely untrue if you were to just take, like, for example, how many carbohydrates and protein can be, per hectare. If you were to compare a monoculture of 1 hectare of corn to a diverse landscape integrating agroforestry, integrating yes, grain crops, but together with fruits and nuts and integrating animals on there. Obviously, the amount of nutrition, of carbohydrates and vitamins and minerals that can come from a diversified landscape is going to be much greater than a monoculture of just corn or just soybeans or whatever it might be. So obviously, I think that diversifying through agroforestry is going to be much more productive for the small scale farmer. It's going to be much better for the subsistence of the family that lives on that landscape, and then helping to find ways to market some of these diverse agroforestry crops. I think that that's a challenge. Like I said, market demand doesn't prioritize these agroforestry crops, and I think trying to find ways to introduce for example, the chacha fruto that I grow here on my farm, is not traditional here, but with local, neighbors, we've given them away. People have tried them; they like them. I think trying to stimulate demand for crops that are healthy for human bodies, but also for the soil, for the ecosystem, is also kind of a challenge that we face.
You may have to educate people on how to use them again.
Yeah.
Sabina has a question. Sabina, go ahead. Activate your microphone and your camera if you can.
So, hi, sorry, I'm not able to put my camera today. Just greetings to everyone, and thank you so much for the presentation, Mr. Tobias. Today, you have said some interesting things about, agriculture and fruit trees. I do come from South Sudan, but I'm lucky because I come from the green belt area. That green line in the middle of Africa, just crossing South Sudan like this, coming from Kenya all the way, to Congo. That's the belt I am in. So it's just almost like the Amazon, you can say. So I have a lot of interest on the issue of agriculture, and we have opportunity to have land. We can acquire land easily. There's no problem about that. But I think we really need to work with you a lot as time goes so that we can implement some of these things, because I have established with some group women organization. Now we could also do a lot of agriculture and help women to do some, agriculture and small, gardening and things like that. So I think I will need your contact so that we can continue from there. Your email address, please.
Thank you, Sabina. I'll put my email again here at the bottom of the chat. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you and hearing about the work that you're thinking of doing there in South Sudan. So certainly.
Yes. And if you can come to South Sudan and help us.
Sure, I would love to.
I know
Yes.
that it sounds risky to go there, but it's okay to go. You can
Yeah,
always
sure.
go with the locals. There's no problem. Yeah.
Certainly.
Okay, let me get the email on the chat. What is it? I haven't yet copied. I can lower my hand.
There's another question, just real quick. One thing I see in chat from Pedro Morai. He says the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change challenge all of us to strengthen local production and resilience efforts. And I think, yeah, what COVID showed us was that the supply lines for the industrial food system are incredibly tenuous, incredibly they're not resilient at all, I think. And if you this was a pandemic that disrupted everything. If we think of the geopolitical tensions, if we think of the war in breadbasket regions like Ukraine, if we think about how global climate change could really cause droughts that affect this global system. I think that every small community, every local government needs to start thinking about, what's the best way to ensure that we'll be able to feed ourselves in a world where, potentially all of these global 6 continent supply lines or supply chains that we depend upon for the food that we eat, are at extreme risk of being interrupted. And so I think it's important to think about, how can we really stimulate, over the next 5 years, let's invest in a agroforestry transition where, we're going to make public funds available for local farmers to start to get these trees in the ground, taking care of them so that, in the future, if the wheat that we import or the corn that we import or all of the different foodstuffs that we import, if all of a sudden that's interrupted, well, we have something in the ground. We have roots that have taken root, that are able to provide something for our locality. I think that that's not only good for local farmers, it's not only good for local ecosystems. I think it also makes sense. It's common sense. If you take an unbiased look at a lot of the instability in the world today, and I think if we had a little bit of foresight, I think we would start, preparing for that right now.
Okay, let's go to Lomongin Joseph. I know that you had your hand up for a while. Go ahead and go ahead and speak. I think we can hear you. And just I see some questions in chat about how you can watch this video after. You can either watch it on the AIU YouTube channel that's on YouTube, or you can go to your student portals and in the quick menu, you'll see AIU Live Classroom in the menu there. Click on there and you'll be able to access all the videos from past classes. Lomongin Joseph, are you able to talk? We don't hear you. Huh? Maybe write your question into chat. But I think we've run to the end of our time. Wow. I would suggest next time that you go over grasslands because that was another big part that was
Mm.
taken over by grazing, and that's another
Yeah.
thing that's affecting worldwide. I mean, where I live in the state of New Mexico, in the United States, it used to be a huge grassland state 150 years ago. And then they brought in like 31 million cows
Mm.
and just ate up and destroyed the grassland. And now there's just a little natural reserve up in the northeast part of the state where they're still protecting a little bit of part of the grassland. But other than that, there's still grazing going on, and the grasslands cannot come back.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I know Alan Savory, I forget the name, the Savory Institute. They're very active in Africa, and their main thing is that yeah, forests are important, obviously, but he makes the point that yeah, and I don't know where he gets his statistics, but he says over half of the world what was not traditionally a forest, right? We live in a very diverse world with different ecosystems, and in many places forests didn't traditionally grow. It was grasslands, it was prairies. And so his whole, the thing that the Savory Institute is involved in is about reestablishing proper management of prairies. Not necessarily saying no animals, because there's always been big animals on prairies, but how do we do it in a way that mimics, how the bison herds, moved over the prairies of the Midwest, or the elephants and the gazelles and all of the ones in Africa. How can we try to mimic these huge herbivores in a way, that really restores these traditional grasslands? So yeah, I think that's a great topic for a future class.
I remember I had a vision in Hawaii, in sort of like a very lucid dream kind of vision, where I arrived at the Hawaiian Islands years ago. There was nobody there, and I was walking through the native grasses and looking at the native palm trees and listening to the wind, just the sound of the wind. It was like the first person arriving at the Hawaiian Islands
Hmm.
and walking through the soil that was so soft because no one had ever stepped foot on it
Mm.
before. And it was just, and it was the Aina Valley that I was looking at. And it was like the first person that had ever walked there and what they were seeing and feeling for the very first time, totally natural.
Hmm.
And the world's come a long way since then. I think it's impossible to find places like that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that, yeah, I mean, obviously I mean, I always, whenever I fly in an airplane and you look down And it's obviously there's the pock marks of the cities, but then everywhere you see the lines that we've made, right? The non-natural lines of roads, of square fields of agriculture. But then recently, the last time I visited my family in the United States, you see from the airplane now all of these contour lines. Like I said, it's become a big movement in lots of parts of big agriculture in the United States. And those are lines that you can say, well, they're not really natural either, but it's much better, a much better. I think that there is a place for human beings to do things in the landscape in a way that tries to regenerate. And how nice would it be if you could, we might not ever get back to that space where you can see a completely untouched landscape, but it would be much more hopeful to see a landscape of contour lines where, soil erosion is being stopped, where water is infiltrating into aquifers instead of, the square lines of agro-industrial farms that are spraying chemicals and things like that. So.
Okay, everybody, that's going to do it. Do you think you'll come back next time and talk about grasslands?
Yeah, I don't have any a next class scheduled, so I'll definitely pencil that one in. I think that's a good topic. Thanks.
Yeah, because that may be even more like affecting people's lives than the
Mm,
forests, because people
yeah,
mainly lived in the grasslands.
yeah.
Okay, so that's going to do it. Everybody, write your assignments, send them in. Tell us what's going on with the trees in your area of the world. Are there projects? Are the trees in devastation mode? Are they growing back? Are they going away? What's going on with trees and what can be done about it? And how can you actually create a business or an organization to confront the problem and then you can make money off of it? Because that's really what we're all doing here is finding work possibilities to improve the world. Tobias Roberts, thank you once again.